I'm Paul O'Halloran. I'm a GP. I've just realised, speaking to friends and colleagues in the building, I've been a GP here for on and off nearly 30 years. I was in the Adelaide Medical Centre for 17 years, then I left to go to Winchester, then came back again about a year ago to help the Adelaide Medical Centre get back on its feet. And it's actually really on its feet and doing some great exercise. It's walking fast and maybe even running. Now, Liz, thank you for inviting me. It is my first time here. What a great place. I know some of the stories already, but seeing the building really, really helps. You give me 15 minutes. I will really do my best to keep to 15 minutes. If you could just shout, shut up, after about 12 and a half, okay? I will be only halfway through the slides, but I apologise. What it is asking me to do is talk about exercise as medicine. And it's something very close to my heart. It's something that I would love for the NHS in the widest sense to be supporting, paying for. And I suspect that because you guys are all here, you know everything I'm going to talk about, but I'm hoping that you'll remember one or two things to convince your friends, your work colleagues, other people you're going to be talking to try and convince them that there's something that you know about already. So my wish is to provide a little bit of evidence about why maybe exercise is a good medicine, and perhaps something about cost effectiveness, and something about why on earth the NHS don't spend as much on supporting exercise generally as they do on something like a torvastatin, or I could list 1,000 other drugs. So, a little bit of background. I'm a GP, I'm Adelaide, I'm a trustee of Energise Me, and if you want to take one thing away from today, search Energise Me on your web browsers and look at the stuff they're doing. They're a great charity, and they used to be part of Sport England, they're now called Energise Me for a very good reason. I'm also, like any GP, we do more than one thing. I'm the chair of the Hampshire Isle of Wight Diabetes Programme Board for the Integrated Care System. Sounds amazing title. I'm not so sure it is amazing, but it certainly means I do a lot of diabetes, and I want to talk a little bit about diabetes this evening. So, to put it into context, exercise is medicine. That's me again. Hang on. Oh, thank you. Right. I put this slide in just to give a perspective over the choices that we are allowed to make for ourselves. So, if you look at the proportional contribution to premature death that we all as a population experience. Now you can argue the figures. These are actually American figures based about probably 10 years ago. But it's going to be roughly round about this sort of proportion. So about a third of your risk as a population, not you individually, but as a population, is going to be because of your parents. So if you chose wisely, you're going to have a great benefit compared to everybody else. You don't get much choice. Then there's a whole load of other stuff that we can influence. Environmental exposure, if you're exposed to a rocket, for example, going through your abdomen, that rather ruins your life opportunities. Healthcare is a small bit, actually, of the effects on you as an individual. That great big bit at the bottom is behavioural pattern choices that in part we make, and choices that are in part thrust upon us in the society that we live in. But those are the influences that I want to talk about around exercise. Now, the big three, the big triad, is number one is probably don't smoke. Actually, if you want to do anything for your personal interest, your personal benefit in terms of living a long but prosperous life in the sense of your personal health, don't smoke is probably the biggest single thing. After that, take some exercise, do some movement, do whatever you want to do. Then after that, it's a combination of diet. By diet, I mean what you eat, how much you eat, what you drink, how much you drink. And there's millions and millions of papers to support approximately these figures. And we can argue over the exact detail, but I think it's pretty established. We all know, don't we? Everyone in this room knows that we as a society are getting less active. We're sitting at screens more. We're getting bigger. And we know that sitting down, not doing exercise and getting bigger is a bit of a disaster. If you look at the rates of diabetes, if you look at the rates of obesity, you look at the rates of heart disease, it's all going the wrong way. I'm not going to labour the point, but I want to put that in just to say we do have an opportunity to change some of that. Now, I have got my British National Formula. I'm a doctor, I prescribe drugs, that's what we do. We prescribe medicine. This British National Formula has got 1,772 pages, and the print is so small that I now can't read it. It's absolutely impossible. Have a look at that. I mean, it's just impossible. But in there is every drug that I'm allowed to prescribe. And guess what? Movement isn't there. I'm going to call it, you see those crossed out things? Sport, exercise. I'm not going to use that term because I think they turn people off. What I really want to use is the word movement, because I don't really mind what you do, I just want people to move a bit. So if I search movement or exercise or sport, it's not in here. In fact, that's not entirely true. Exercise is in here, but in terms of messaging, the only way you can look at the index and get the word exercise is exercise-induced asthma. And that's really not the message I want to put out to you. So, it's not in there. If it were in there, what would it feel like? What would it look like? As a doctor, I would say, well, what's its generic name? Well, its generic name will be movement, maybe, or exercise or sport, but I'm going to call it movement. But what are the brands? What are the brands? You know, so we know that Lipitor, and we know there's a whole bunch of brands for other things. I think the generic name is movement. The brand name can be jogging, or cycling, or walking, or swimming, or aerobics. Actually, I've put wobbling in there because my kids, when I dance, they say it's more like wobbling than dancing. So, but it's still moving. It's all movement, and if you can do this. Rolling, as people I'm sure know better than I do, is all around how you use a wheelchair. It doesn't really matter providing a bit of you move. You can move really, really fast as an elite sport athlete, or you can move a lot slower like me. So, if it were, that's the drug, that's the molecule. What's the dose? Pretty much, there's universal agreement now for an adult with no special needs. The dose is about 150 minutes a week of moderate exercise. I think probably everyone in this room knows that. It's nuanced, it's complicated, actually, but in fact, if I wanted to give out one simple message to the vast majority of adults, it would be 150 minutes of moderate exercise. We can define what we mean by moderate. We've got a lovely chart there, the RPE scale. Moderate, I mean, you can still talk, but you can't sing. And that will change as you get fitter. About 150 minutes, build it up slowly, like any drug. You wouldn't want to start at 150 minutes, or this is a week, not a day. It's more in children. The younger you are, the more you need. And the guidelines that are coming out now are much more around a balance of just doing whatever exercise you want, together with some specific strengthening and resistance exercises. So let's just take that as read for the moment, okay? There's a load of evidence. The evidence is extraordinary. Now, I put this slide in specifically because this is a dose-response curve around physical activity and benefit. Benefit, and I'll talk about what I mean by benefit in a few minutes. But the important thing about this is that at the lowest dose of this drug movement, you get the best benefit, the best kickback. So, if you're in this part here, where you're basically sitting all of the time, and we know that a quarter of all men and a fifth of all women, roughly, sitting and doing no active exercise, just going up a little bit, just by a few minutes a day, you'll be on the sharp point of that curve. So the benefits happen at really low doses and continue. And if you decide that what you want to do is become a marathon runner and run a marathon every day for a year, the benefit that you'll be getting will still be huge, but the difference between running a marathon every day and running a marathon once a week is small. So the benefit is at the low dose. This graph I put in because there are different benefits for different bits of the system. So if you look at blood pressure or insulin sensitivity, you get that benefit almost straight away. So if you have a heavy meal and you're pre-diabetic, you go for a walk 10 minutes after that meal, your blood cells will be sensitized to the insulin and actually have a benefit almost straight away. If you look at HDL, which is a bit of cholesterol, high density lipoprotein, that takes a lot more exercise to have a profound effect, and also takes a lot longer. So the effect is nuanced and changes over a long period of time. So what are the indications? Now, I've just listed, I think, if I went round, if I had time, what I do sometimes is I go around the room and think, oh, what do you think the benefits are? We list a whole bunch of things, and pretty much no one gets it wrong, because it's everything, there's almost everything that exercise improves. There's very few things exercise don't. So, obesity, I think this is an area which I'm not so sure about, because I think that there's as much evidence about decreasing weight as increasing weight, and I think that people oscillate weight quite a lot. But what exercise does do, it certainly mitigates a lot of the risks associated with obesity. And I think actually there's increasing evidence that a lot of the benefits of obesity actually were disguised by exercise. So I think actually it's exercise that's the big benefit. And certainly people who are doing exercise and are overweight are at much, much lower risk than those people who don't exercise and are normal weight. So, obesity, mitigation of obesity. Diabetes is my area. We all know that exercise improves diabetes significantly. We also know that weight decrease improves diabetes as well. But again, I think that's being masked by exercise. Heart disease, 35%. If you use this drug, take this drug, your risk of having heart disease is decreased by 35%. Heart disease is by far the biggest killer in this country as one individual group. So that's a big, big figure. There is really strong evidence for breast and colon and other cancers that, again, application of this drug decreases your risk of getting breast cancer by 20%, your risk of getting colon cancer by 30%. That's big figures. Falls. Now, AD, I know you're going to talk much about fat, so I won't mention another word. Hypertension, you can cure hypertension by doing exercise. In some sensible bits of the world, the first treatment for hypertension is exercise. It's not a tablet, it's exercise. That list is really powerful, but that's only half of it. There's way more stuff that this stuff does. It also talks about osteoporosis and fractures, like I mentioned, Aidan's mentioned again. Osteopenia. Now, osteopenia is the decrease of of muscle mass that we all get as we get older. The only cure for that is exercise. In fact, it's highly lethal as you get older and you sit more. You've got to counteract that by exercise, no other way. Depression, anxiety. Now, this, and I know this is where Sam is going to talk about a little bit later. I think there's a lot of work going on around depression, anxiety, and green spaces, and doing some exercise and doing some movement. Amazing that we can have one drug that does all this. Dementia, but the bottom bit is the bit that I want to focus on. I was going to start this talk by saying I'm going to talk about death and dying. Now, I didn't. I thought that'd be too cruel. But if you want to decrease your risk of dying prematurely, use this drug. And it's simple. Actually, 1 in 3, roughly, people who die prematurely could be prevented potentially by using this drug. So, now, I then want to talk, if it was a drug in the PNF, I want to talk about breastfeeding. I want to talk about what happens in pregnancy, because we know that most drugs are actually pretty horrible in breastfeeding, pretty horrible if you're pregnant. This isn't. This is brilliant. If you're pregnant, if you want to start breastfeeding, take this drug. It actually makes things better. There are some side effects. We'll talk about side effects. Well, this list of side effects: stronger muscles, lower blood pressure, you sleep a lot better, you concentrate better, you've got better balance, you feel pretty good. They're pretty good side effects, actually. Are there any bad side effects? Well, occasionally people fall over. Occasionally people do too much. They take too much of this drug and they get some hamstring injuries. I actually ruptured my Achilles tendon playing my son at badminton. Stupid thing to do anyway. So there are some side effects, but they're trivial compared to these benefits. Now, I put this slide in just to remind me that this isn't magic pixie dust. This isn't sort of, I'm going to say this isn't homeopathy, this isn't turmeric, this isn't something that's wafted in from outer space. The evidence of the molecular changes that exercise induces are extraordinary. Now, I don't know what most of these things stand for. Actually, I do, but I don't really. But I know myokines are the things that exercise induce. They're little bits of protein that flap around. And they affect things like telomeres, and telomeres are the little genetic codes at the end of your chromosomes that as they wear out, your cells get older and they start not reproducing very well. And it's been shown repeatedly and easily that those myokine effects have an effect on telomeres. They have an effect on a whole load of other, of the The myokines are about 3,000 little bits of protein that zoom around all over the place. And they can be measured by clever people in universities like Sam. And they can be, and you can show that things like, as a diabetologist, I would say the GLP-1s, the glycogen-like peptides, we're using those as drugs. And in fact, almost as strong a drug as I give out as a tablet is exercise. We know the TNF-alphas, the tissue necrosis factors, we know that that has a profound effect in production of cancer cells and atheroma. And all of these things, there's good molecular biology evidence of it working. So it's not just pixie dust. So I want to just I've got 2 minutes. I've got very, very briefly.
I'm going to give you 5.
Is it 5?
Yeah, I'll give you 5, yeah.
Thank you. Right. I was very briefly want to talk about the Darkwing study. Now this was a study that was first published in the Lancet in the early 90s. It was back in 1986. A bunch of Chinese people got together and they decided, this is one of those sort of seminal papers that we all know about in the diabetes world. Although in fact it's been suppressed a bit for I'll tell you why. I'm going to put this up. It's all of the longitudinal study was published in the Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious journals on the planet. So you can get into the Lancet. Many people try and fail. These guys got in repeatedly. It was a study where, now don't look at that, but basically what they did was they screened a whole bunch of people. They had 577 who were not diabetic, but were on the way to diabetes. One of the criticisms of exercise has always been, well, the people that exercise are the ones obviously who are going to live longer because they can exercise. And so it isn't exercise that's doing it, it's something else that allows you to exercise that's doing it, so that only the fit people exercise. I think that's rubbish, and this proves it. So what they did, they divided up the people into 4 groups. One was their standard treatment, then they had another bunch of people who had exercise, another bunch of people who had diet, and another bunch of people who had all 3. And they then said, right, get out there. This was randomised, it was prospective, so there was no, oh, well, you look a little bit overweight, you should have the exercise, or you look a bit overweight, none of that. It was just purely random process. What did they do? Now, over a period of time, they kept on looking at these people to see whether they became diabetic, and that was the original plan, was to see how many of these people with pre-diabetes, not actually diabetic at the time, how many of them would go on to become diabetic. As you can see from this graph, now they published every 6 years, and they're now up to 30 years of following through. So, and it's as a strength of trial, that is just brilliant. You can't repeat something now that's 30 years old. Can't do it. As you can see, from about 10 years, there was a big difference between the intervention group and the control group in terms of diet, exercise, and the combination of the 2. So they said, good news, we can prevent people who are on the way to diabetes to becoming diabetic by a mixture of diet and exercise. In the first 6 years, they separated out diet, exercise, and diet and exercise. And the most effective of those 3 groups was exercise. More effective than diet and exercise, which is really interesting. The least effective, obviously, was the control group, which was just neither one of those 2 things. They then carried on observing these people for the next 30 years. This bit, now it becomes a bit more interesting, I think, because after 12 years, a CVD event is things like a heart attack or a stroke or something like that, something that's fairly obvious and you can be picked up in your medical records fairly reliably. After 12 years, there was no difference. But after 30 years, it's absolutely massive. This intervention lasted 6 years. So you have 6 years of diet, 6 years of exercise, then you went about your life with no other intervention whatsoever. Then, so you had your 6 years of treatment, drug, and at the end of that you had your normal treatment, whatever you were going to get. So 30 years, massive difference. So there was a massive decrease in CVD events. And people understand p-values, 0.006. So that's really, really significant. Looking at other things, microvascular disease is things like eye disease and kidney disease. You don't want any of it. Again, not very much difference at all at 12 years, but by 30 years it's absolutely huge. Death's good for doctors' records because we're good at recording. And we're not good at recording why you died, but we're quite good at recording that you died. After 30 years, massive difference, 0.02 p-value. So that 6 years of intervention 30 years ago is still having a profound effect 30 years downstream. So that's CVD deaths, significant. All-cause mortality, so that's just dying of anything, 0.0015. So this, because it's prospective and because it's random, it gives massive evidence around a diet and exercise in this population, and you can argue that maybe pre-diabetics aren't the standard population for everybody, but in this population it has a dramatic effect on how you live and whether you live. I think this is transmittable to almost everybody. The reason they chose this population is because they're a risky population, so it will show up the differences faster than the standard population. But in terms of mortality, 10 years, no difference. 30 years, massive difference. So I think that's part of the evidence base around exercise, around movement as medicine, that is irrefutable. And this is a relatively, it's a 30-year-old trial now. The data that's coming through, there's very, very good chemistry behind why it should happen, and there's very, very good outcomes. So as a result of all of this, the chief medical officers of England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland all agreed. This, in September 2019, they came up with a bunch of guidelines. This is actually the second iteration of those guidelines. The first, you probably all know this, the first iteration was 2011. It made a bit of noise, but not very much. So it's not Chris Whitty. It was a lady called I can't remember. He came along because COVID has really interfered with a lot of this. But if you want to read anything on the basis of this talk, just search the internet and find the Chief Medical Officer's Physical Activity Guidelines. They're beautifully written, and it's all evidence-based. They have come up with a whole bunch of things like this, which I'm sure you've all seen. They recommend, they drill down into different age groups, different types of people. So this just happens to be an infographic for adults and older adults. So 150 minutes, of which maybe 75 minutes should be vigorous, build some strength, and some figures around why we should do it. So that sort of thing is easily digestible. There's the same infographic around children, which they define as 5 to 18, quite a big group, and if you really want to be good, you can drill down at different age groups. And they also do a 0 to 5 infographic. They also have a pregnant lady infographic. They also have a person living with disability infographic. This is pretty non-cutting edge medicine, actually. This is pretty much mainstream, and they publish that under the name of absolute no-brainer, guaranteed. Let's not talk about it. It's a proven thing. If you really want to go down into the big detail, we can do better than this. Actually, this is the barest minimum. So, I won't talk about cost, but basically the cost of not moving are these sort of figures. They're big figures. Again, let's suppose that NICE 2018, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, let's suppose they get an order of magnitude wrong. So they're no longer a billion, they're order of magnitude less than a billion. It's still a hell of a lot, 100 million. King's Fund, Public Health England, 7.4 billion they recommend. They recommend not moving costs society as a whole. And then there's a Cambridge University paper which is 500,000 premature deaths a year in the UK. Now, and comparing that to obesity, which is about 250,000, so obesity is less risky than not moving. Now again, all of those figures we can spend an hour just talking about one paper. But if they got an order of magnitude wrong, it's still a jolly big figure. So, what I really want to say is this: any movement is good. The less you move now, the smallest increment you build up, the better it's going to be for you. This was defined as a pandemic before this pandemic. So how many pandemics do we need? I wish we'd spent as much on the movement, lack of movement pandemic as we have spent on a COVID pandemic. I don't wish COVID pandemic on anyone, but I think we need to put movement into everything we do. I know it's difficult because we live in a society that makes us not move. It's not rocket science. It's way more complicated than that, because for me as a doctor to say move more, that's taken me what, a second? To actually implement it in my practice, I still haven't done it and I've been doing it for 30 years. So it is more complicated, but it's not. Thank you. Do you want to? Right, okay. I've just got this little video clip. Now, it's a bit controversial, but I want to start challenging individual people to actually make a difference. And I think this is what this does. Now, you can argue that it's not fair, and I agree it's not fair, because some choices, as I said, if your environment involves a rocket through your tummy, that isn't a choice that you have that you can make. But there are some choices that we all can make. This is Canada.
What will your last 10 years look like? Will you be quick enough for a game of tag with your grandchild? Strong enough to embrace every moment? Will you grow old with vitality? Or get old with disease? It's time to decide. The average Canadian will spend their last 10 years in sickness. Change your future at makehealthlast.ca.
Thank you. That was, it's not fair, but some of the choices that we individually make have a direct impact on us. And we can change those choices. We have the power, we can do things differently. And part of the movement that I want to try and create is for all of us individually to try and make those choices ourselves. Now, places like this really, really help those people who don't have as many choices as I do. I can choose whether I go for a walk, go for a run, go on my bike. Many people don't have those choices, but they still have choices. And we need to recognise that we do have those choices.